Oh, sailor, have you found your perfect sea? Today I want to talk about social formation, and the reason I want to talk about this is because it is one of those things that if you just make certain assumptions about it, or if you speak as if it didn't matter, or if you speak as if it were just a construction, that's a very famous, infamous term, common term that started appearing increasingly so during the 1960s, is society is just a social construction, implying that we could make it be whatever we want it to be. Now, as you know, the whole purpose of this series of talks is really to prevent you from being a complete idiot. Now, an idiot is not someone who doesn't know something. An idiot is someone who thinks they know what they don't know. And unfortunately, we do live in a society of complete and utter idiocy because we have an educated elite, young people and their professors who have studied some things, but fundamental things are overlooked. And with our thinking, if we have a big oversight, or we assume something that is not the case in a story that we're telling or a theory that we have, if we're assuming something, or we think we know something and we've got it completely wrong, then the rest of it, just throw it away. It's a complete and utter waste of time. So the human race, if its theoretical weight could be, measured in some shape or form, you'd have to say 99.9% of it is total garbage. And the reason it's garbage is because it's missing something. And the reason it's missing something, you remember hopefully from the last talk, we've got very small brains. So the bigger the ambition is with respect to a theory, the greater the danger is that you've missed something. Now, the great success story of human ingenuity with theory happens to be in the natural sciences, or I would say even some of the natural sciences. There, beginning with the Copernican revolution, that's basically realizing that the sun doesn't go around the earth, but the earth goes around the sun, that it's a solar system that we have, and this gives birth to the idea of an open universe. And then there were other developments in the observation of the heavenly bodies, and then that moved to the observation of the physical bodies, so that by the time of Sir Isaac Newton, who had identified gravitational forces, it looked like human beings, to use the phrase of Rene Descartes, could be lords and masters of nature because they could study nature and see exactly what was involved in the mechanics of its reproduction or in the mechanics of its existence. Now, some people, many people in fact, at one stage or another, and still to this day, unfortunately, think that human beings can be understood exactly in the same, as akin to natural beings, and therefore the natural sciences will help us understand what we are. Now, this is sadly very wrong, and the reason it's very wrong is because we are creatures that can change our mind, that can will things, and that also act on the basis of symbolic interaction. So the values that we ascribe to things can be culturally so diverse, even if we could find some underlying structural similarities. Let's take one that I think is a very, very common, in fact, I would say even a fundamental feature of existence of human beings, in their symbolically generating participation with each other and the world. And that is our tendency to find something that we place above us to give us orientation and which we give unassailable authority to. Global religions are that. Ideologies are that. And you heard me talk about ideologies, and the reason I don't like them is because they ultimately give some idea a potency it just doesn't have. It just does not have that idea. Which is not to say that it is within us to be able to lay down the idea which we can then impose upon reality as such. Now, reality is just reality. We have ideas about reality. Our ideas generate reality because they are part of our symbolic order. But the symbolic nature of human participation, human imagination, is such that it's always very elusive. So if, for example, we always do tend to find something to give us orientation and we give that unassailable authority, that's something I think you can widely see, whether it's Islam, it's Hinduism, it's Buddhism, it's Christianity, it's Judaism, it's Marxism, it's some other fascism, some other ideology, you're seeing a common feature. And yet at the same time, you being able to identify that, doesn't really help us very much when we come to dealing with the day-to-day practices, the involvements, the kind of tragedies that we're trying to avoid, the kind of things that we're trying to do in our life or trying to improve in our life. That's something that we should be aware of, that we have this tendency, but if we ignore the specifications of how that's played out within a certain community or within a certain group, then we haven't really understood it at all. So that's part of the problem, isn't it? Part of the problem is, how do we focus upon the specifics that matter to us and not ignore them, but also keeping a fair enough understanding of a bigger picture, a more comprehensive insight that enables us to make comparisons between things. That, I think, is something that we always need to bear in mind. So when we just talk about principles as if our ideas were going to play themselves out and map themselves out on reality, the danger is that we're not taking reality seriously. Now, what I'm saying, and what's driving this series of lectures, is not something that was never seen before. It's been seen by a lot of people as a problem. And unfortunately, though, many of the solutions to overcome what is perceived as a problem only make matters worse. Whereas I tend to say, well, you just accept that. That is a problem. That's the nature of our condition. So let's just get on with that, not expect too much. Let's be a little more compromising with our potential, which is small, and the complexity of reality, which is great. Now, two thinkers who basically would have agreed with everything I've said up to a point were Karl Marx and Friedrich Nietzsche. Both of them, I think, end up being diabolical thinkers. When I say diabolical thinkers, I think they leave the world worse off than better off, even though their fundamental insight is extremely valuable. And it's one of them, in the case of Karl Marx, that had one insight that is going to be the basis of this lecture, and that's going to be talking about social formation. Unfortunately, he destroys the insight almost immediately. So the insight he had, and Nietzsche has a very similar insight, is the danger, in the case of Karl Marx, he calls it alienation, that then becomes known as reification. He gets this idea or hypostasization, he gets it from Ludwig Feuerbach, and that is the tendency, which I'm talking about too, is that we take an idea of something as if it were the reality itself, and we get caught up in that idea. Friedrich Nietzsche does it with his critique of Platonism. And I agree with his critique of Platonism, and to a certain extent, I agree with Marx's point about reification, hypostasization, forgive my pronunciation, that goes back to Ludwig Feuerbach. There's something that's right there. But in both those cases, they immediately come up with a great big answer to how to deal with the world, to how to make the world, the human world, a certain way. In the case of Karl Marx, it's get rid of private property. In the case of Friedrich Nietzsche, it's to have a Superman. Now, in this talk, I'm not interested in going into the details of that. I just want to say, I think in both of those cases, the moment they've intervened to dictate what the future should be like, to teach people what kind of future they need and how they will solve all their problems, get rid of private property, Karl Marx, have a certain hierarchical arrangement in which there's a certain race, a higher race, as Nietzsche calls it, that will be bred, that will give meaning to the earth. I think this is just terrible, rubbish. It's terrible. And part of the terribleness of it, it's just so lacking in humility. And what we can be, we don't know. We're a mystery to ourselves. So the last thing we need is some 25-year-old guy like Karl Marx, or much the same age, or 30-year-old Friedrich Nietzsche, telling us exactly how we should be. If you need that kind of leadership, and you notice that word leadership today, it's everywhere. So there's a lot of people, in fact I think we live in a world in which Marx plus Nietzsche very much explains the intellectual dynamics of what's going on. That is, there is a group of people who are an elite, and we'll do a whole talk about elites later, who think that they have the right to dictate, or their ideas about the world are so great that they should lead us, and they run universities and they have programs on cultural leadership, and we, poor saps like you and me, are going to be the led. Well, I'm with the saps. You know, if there's two kinds of people, the deplorables and the unbearables, I prefer the deplorables, because I prefer to hang out with people who know they don't know very much. Whereas I find unbearable people who think that they see enough of reality that they're going to take us into it. Now, that's the rant side of it, and that's what I'm fighting against. Now, I'll go back again to Karl Marx and talk about the good point that he had, besides the one I just mentioned, which he says it and then he completely gets rid of it by, you know, knowing how to solve all our problems by getting rid of private property, and not really taking into account, not in sufficient depth anyway, the kinds of problems that are solved by the existence of private property. But do bear in mind, and I said this in the last lecture, everything we do creates a problem. We're problem creators. That's what we are. So we come along, the next generation has to solve the problems that have been generated out of the solutions that we came up with as a species to the last set of problems we have. And the lie or the folly is thinking that we can, and it's unconscionable that there's an elite and that people take seriously this group of fools who think they can design something which will be problemless. Honestly, a poor 13-year-old girl in a field on her knees in 12th century France or something has more intelligence than that, really. Okay, I've got that off my chest. So, good thing Marx saw. He read some political economy. That's very important. Why is it good to read political economy? And what was it that Marx saw? Well, Marx understood that the political economy of a society really matters. He called it the material conditions. He then went on to say that the ideology of a society, the ideational part of the society, was really a reflection of the material conditions. Now, I find this sloppy way to put it, but he kind of has a point, and I want to retrieve the good point. So, the good point is this: all human society has to find the resources to enable its survival and reproduction. If it doesn't find those resources, it dies. This is the foundational insight of political economy. It wants to understand how the resources are developed and then how they are extracted and traded, and what happens through that process of resource development. And ultimately economics will be about what is the most efficient way to develop human resources. And we ourselves, of course, are a resource. Hands, legs, every entertainer is drawing upon their resources. There's all sorts of ways in which we can be a resource. If we're not that well developed, we might at least be able, if there's a need for it, to go somewhere and screw bottle tops onto a bottle on an assembly line. That's the resource we'd have in that case. And then when we can find a machinery to displace that activity, then the human resource will be displaced by a machine resource. Now, there's nothing moral in this. And that was a good thing that Marx understood. That it's just a process. It's a material process. He calls it material. My problem with it, his way of thinking, is it's not materialistic enough. But in a way, this dualism of materialism versus idealism, I don't think is a very helpful way to do things, because we're the kind of creature that we act in a world of meaning, which is what I was talking about, the symbolic dimension of our participation. That is what we give value to and why we give value to it. It has a symbolic meaning to it. There's nothing in and of itself that is valuable to anything that someone does. What makes it take on value is that someone recognizes, believes it has value. It's a kind of act of faith, and certain things have value within a certain community, and in another community they mean nothing. There's no dynamic of appreciation. There's no cultivation of the qualities that make those kind of things acceptable. So, when though we want to talk about society as it is or should be, when we are looking to find a way to make the world a better place. So that's really why I'm talking about this, because we are now living in a world in which it's just commonplace for people in school or straight out of school to all talk about the way they can fix up the world, the way the world should be. And there's a kind of mishmash of moral ideas. Moral ideas can be purely rational. That is, they're just ideas generating ideas. The philosopher Immanuel Kant was a great defender of this way of doing morality. He argued that a moral idea should not in any way, shape or form be influenced by anything in the world, so that if it was impacted upon, even emotionally, by what you liked or disliked or loved or hated, then your moral criteria, what he calls a moral imperative, the rule you want to give to, he calls it a maxim, but the rule you want to give to making the world a better place, that would be badly affected by that. It would be a bad thing. Whereas it has to be the freedom of reason itself that enables someone to come up with a principle that is worthy of a free, dignified creature like a human being. I'm sort of slipping into the way that Immanuel Kant talked. Now, in this case, he was smart enough to realise that the empirical, the world of things and stuff and feelings, that could not matter. That, in fact, that must not matter if it's to be purely reasonable. Now, in the case of Kant, what he argued, and those of you who studied philosophy would know, is an ethical position called deontology. It is right because it is right. Let the world perish, it does not matter. Now, if you want to believe that, you can believe that. But there's absolutely no reason on God's earth, or anyone's earth, why anyone should believe that. I think that's completely nuts. But clearly Kant didn't think it completely nuts, and he would go, well, if you don't believe that, then you don't really understand the dignity of human persons and the greatness of reason and blah, blah, blah. And you think, so what? I don't think human reason is that great. I don't think anything we do is that great. Yeah, Jimi Hendrix played great guitar. There's been great statues made. There's great engineers, but spare us, really. There's greatness and there's the universe itself. And within it all, we've got small brains. We've got, some people, bigger brains, a bit bigger, and we do things. That's great, but this way of speaking, it's deranged. And I think what that kind of, so rights talk, which I'll give a lecture on that, in many ways I think is a certain kind of derangement. It sounds good, but if you wake up and you start to go, hang on, what are we talking about really? What can you deliver? If you're saying, everyone has a right to free education, and you go, well, okay, but how much economic development must you have to have the resources to enable a certain group of people? Which people have the right to it? At what age? Do they have the right all the time? Who is to service that right? And that's the real question, who's to service it? And that's the, if you like, the economics, the material. So any of this kind of talk is meaningless unless it somehow accesses the material dimension of the claim, of the, let's just say the claim. So this is why Karl Marx, in my opinion, was kind of right to pay attention to the social mode of production, or the economic mode of production, and the social formation that is predicated around that mode of production. So this is where I totally agree with Marx. Then he goes off crazy. He reduces classes to two classes. He talks about other classes, but eventually it's going to come down to a class contestation between capitalist classes and the working classes. Now, I'm not going to go into a full-on critique of Karl Marx here, but the reason I'm raising this is because usually when people talk about the material dimensions of production, they're going to start thinking along with Karl Marx. Whereas, really, what Marx was doing was thinking like a political economist. And what I want to do now is get us to think political economy plus sociology. Because the claim I'm going to make now is you cannot think about the world in any serious manner unless at some point you start to talk about one of these two disciplines, and probably both of these disciplines. And that's because disciplines compartmentalise, but our problems aren't compartmentalised. So given now that we live in a world where it is perfectly normal for people of a certain age, of a certain education, to talk about how to fix up the world, what we should be doing this. So, for example, I was watching, there's a young guy called Tim Cast is the thing. I like Tim, he's a nice guy, and I think he's a very open-minded fellow. And he had on his show, he had two guys, Charlie Kirk, who positions himself on the right, and a guy called, I think it was Vosh, I'd never heard of him before, positions himself on the left. Now, I want to talk about Vosh for a moment, and this is very much related to it. Vosh struck me as a pretty typical product of a certain kind of liberal arts, North American education, extremely eloquent, but totally unserious. Because he knows everything, he knew everything. There's nothing that this guy would not know. And he would always know where to know it, because this is the kind of person that's been cultivated in our modern world. Now, the discussion at one point was talking about reparations for slavery for black Americans. Now, I just say this dogmatically. If you don't know the problems associated with that solution, then you are complete. You know nothing about economics, and I think you know little about human psychology, and I think you've got no understanding of human character. The consequences of that, just thinking about the consequences of that, just the very formulation, that kind of solution. It might make people feel morally good to talk about this and pat themselves on the back, but in terms of actually fixing anything, it's just garbage. Now, I'm not even going to have an argument about that. It's just not worth arguing. But if you do want to know about it, go and learn some economics. Go and listen to Thomas Sowell. So why am I raising this? It's simply because in that discussion, what never came through was any notion of anything other than reality being more complicated than simply understanding the morality that's in and of itself. This happened to such and such a group, therefore we should do this. And it was as if none of the possible consequences that would play themselves out in reality would be playing themselves out in reality. And you can think about it yourself. I don't even want to go into it. As I said, I just find the whole thing too silly. Now, when you think about society, one of the most important components to understand the different formations that we perceive, I want to use the term evolve, and I want to do this in a really neutral term, but it is, in one sense, what we're seeing is complexity of adaptation in different social formations. I'm not saying what's better or not. It's not a moral judgment. I'm not interested in that. If you think that people living in a small group, struggling day to day, or even having enough day to day, as long as they can stay out of everybody else's existence, if you think that'd be a great life, good on you. You know, you think that. I don't want to change your mind on that. That's what you think. But what we do know is that as human societies get bigger in number, then the number of tasks that are needed for the group to survive will also increase. And as that number of tasks increase, you start to see a division of labour. And indeed, again, the young Marx saw this absolutely right, only he jumped to an insane conclusion, but he absolutely saw it, because it's the foundation of the discipline of economics. He saw that all society, as it becomes increasingly complicated, is built around the division of labour, and that's the basis of economic behaviour. And another word for the division of labour, which is not sufficiently appreciated, I think, is the word classes. Because all a class is a particular group who engage in the same kind of activity, the same kind of, and I'll use this word now broadly, labour. Now, you might think, oh, but surely the upper classes, they're not engaging in any kind of labour. Well, this is something that is often, unfortunately, not well understood, but it should be understood, is the reason that you had the kind of class formations that you found, and it's not only in Europe, but anywhere you find a certain scale of society, of division of labour and authority systems, you'll start to see very similar kinds of authority structures. Initially, you have the warlord. Then you have the lords around the warlord. They agree to follow this one, for whatever reason. Force of personalities, force of arms, whatever. So the strongest warlord will always be the one that's best able to broker the powers of the other powers. Now, over time, as this group settles and as the society around that settles, these warriors become more and more, and the crown itself, we'll use those terms now. So the king and the warriors, the lords working with the king, they become more and more used to the benefits of the power that was once expended by them, and it becomes sort of woven into the tapestry of daily life. If you think that that's purely oppressive, which is the way in which authority is spoken about so often today, then you've misunderstood something fundamental. And that is, first of all, why is it that other people would gravitate around this interest, but also who benefits from this? And it's not only them. Because what you find everywhere in society is you have one group that's basically food suppliers, and those groups then have to protect the food suppliers. So even if originally we've got a gangster, again, think of gangster movies, what is a gangster, how does the mafia work? Well, it's a protection racket. It offers protection. And we know what they're saying is, or what they do is, we'll burn down your building if you don't pay us protection. Okay. So now one of the reasons when we look at something like the mafia, we can say, well, it's really, it's illegal, is they're not needed. That is, you don't need them to protect you. But if we scale it back to prior to the state, which is really just this set of brigands writ large, these warlords writ large, then reproducing themselves in terms of meting out justice to where there's various contestations going on. You can see that it's the same thing. That is, there's a need for protection. Now, it's not an artificially, when you've got the mafia, they've actually created the need by just bullying you. But prior to someone protecting you, and the reason you don't need the mafia is because you've got the state. But prior to the state, what you've got is groups needing some kind of protection, and what's at the basis of that too is they've reached a certain scale. So again, let's take it right back to the earliest groups. We see that, weaponry, everyone has to have, or the group needs weapons. We know that one of the biggest sources of, or causes of death was violence in the various anthropological excavations of burial sites all indicate this, the incredibly high amount of death through violence. So giving play to the idea that everything was nice and peaceful, why would it have been peaceful? There's very few resources. There's resource contestation, and that doesn't even allow for the fact that I did mention this in an earlier lecture. Things like, sexual behaviour, sexual predatory behaviour, things like that. So, authority is being predicated upon the need that you have because you have a larger kind of society. And the larger kind of society, the biggest social formation is settlement. That's so when you have a wandering group and then when you have a settled society, that means that you can now cultivate the food, but you need an army to protect that because there's going to be people trying to come in and get that food. So you can see, and the simple point is this, there's a symbiotic relationship. Now that symbiotic relationship is built around social formation, and that social formation is built around the division of labour. And as we study different social formations, we will notice, and again, this was all stuff that Karl Marx knew and all the liberal political economists knew it as well, we will see that what you have is different kinds of activity, economic productivity. And the way in which they meld together is very much an indication of the kind of society that you've got. The French Revolution was really the beginning of the overthrow of the entire whole old way of being in the world, the whole old order. But basically what you had was a class of people whose function over time had started to dwindle, they were beneficiaries of that system because of their status, but where they were not needed, they start to become resentful. The other people become resentful towards them. They start to become useless. They start to become just a cynical group of people without function or purpose. And that is bound up to the kind of economic activity that is going on within that world. And it's also bound up in as the military becomes increasingly professionalised, and again, that's something that starts to occur a bit later. But as you've got a more professionalised military caste system, then the old system of lords and aristocracy it no longer has any purpose. So, what once gave a group its purpose, from a later vantage point, can easily be forgotten. And they're just seen as just a parasite upon society. And again, you see it in the case of Russia. They thought that the old landed aristocracy, the Tsar, that they were just social parasites, when in fact they hadn't been social parasites, but the function had changed. And it was very difficult for, say, in the case of Russia, for the Tsar to know how to get these other groups to compromise without completely creating havoc and rebellion against him. And this is a tragedy of what happens with the development of social formations, the development of the division of labour, is the status that's given and that's required of certain classes starts to change. But no one wakes up in the morning and thinks, well, I'm just going to walk away from all this. Christians did way back when, but in the main, people don't go, my social function is useless. Even, look, if you take something like Black Lives Matter in the US, right? So you've got all these people who are professors and they're students wanting to say that Black Lives Matter, and they're white, they feel guilty, they want to give it. But, problem solved. All you have to do is go and give them your house, give them your car, give them your keys, walk away, give them your bank account. No one's doing that. No one. Why? Well, it's the same reason that the aristocracy couldn't walk away, because they get up in the morning, they've got a life to live, they've got all these dependents upon them, they've got all their indebtedness to service. That's just the way the world is. So what you often have with an aristocracy is it's seeing itself, it looks in the mirror, it's a little bit like me. I look in the mirror, I see a younger me. They look in the mirror, they see a purpose that goes back many generations, and but if that's not being reproduced, if it's not being acted out, it's meaningless. Especially where you have another group who, whenever, with revolutions, follow the money. You're always going to find taxation. All taxation is the extraction of resources from one group to service another group. It's moving, resource manoeuvring. That's what a state is. And that's what the warlord does. They just say, you do this, you give us that. We'll take the surplus, we'll give it to our mates. If they simply keep taking it, that's rather precarious, because the group beneath them will start to look for other people that give them a better deal. This happens it happens all the time. That's why the Ottomans, for example, could make such inroads into Christendom, because it had nothing to do with the religion. It had simply to do with they got a better deal, and that's always going to be the case. So any elite, and our elite now is a very different kind of elite. It's got to watch itself. So having hold of the institutions, and our world is more complicated. That is, there's simply division of labour. There's a greater number of people personing the institution. There's a greater number of institutions that seep into our lives that we have to deal with. But there's a serious question of whether those institutions are so destructive of life that this can stay. You know, that this elite, every elite, all societies have an elite. All an elite is those people that, for whatever they've done, have the authority to act on behalf of the supposed group, of the group, supposedly act on behalf of the group. They act on its behalf. And there's always a tendency for it to disassociate its interest from the interest beneath it. You know, when you hear Hillary Clinton call those people deplorables, anyone who's got a nose for sociology or history would have seen this is why there's such a division in not only North America, but it's in Western Europe, it's in Western societies generally. You've got it's completely sociological, it's completely economic, and it's a symptom of an elite that's disassociated its interests, its views of the way the world should be, which also benefit it. Let's be very clear here. Its views about the way the world should be cost it nothing. They don't lose anything. There's all sorts of jobs and career prospects out there by pursuing this narrative. And then the other group, who are the group that put food on the table for that group. They are the group that does all the servicing for that group. Who just don't see the world in those terms, have reacted. And at the moment we're living in, it is really not that different from what Russia was undergoing between 1860 to 1918. Maybe we're something like 1880 or 1890, or what was happening in France from 1760 or so up until the Revolution. You know, there's this great transformation, and it's a class transformation. It is built around the kind of division of labour we have. It has to do, in our case, with the kind of spread of the elite. And as I said, I'm not against an elite, because I don't see you can have, what's it mean to be for and against? It's a bit like, you know, one of the problems with people, the way they speak about politics today, is because they think they know how to fix up the world, they think, you know, you can have this hat or that hat. You can have this ideology or that ideology. And that ideology is not going to fix up the world. You'll come back to the same problems. The ideology can lead to a lot of death. It can lead to a lot of craziness, but it won't lead to a lot of solutions. So what we have, the interests that we have, the mechanisms of social reproduction, which are very closely aligned with the kind of division of labour we have, the kind of which do seep into our symbolic ordering. That's what's the tendency of an elite to disassociate itself from the group on whose behalf it's supposed to be acting. That is a common tendency. We see example after example of that. Now, one way in which that weakness, and this may be what we're facing actually, one way in which that weakness can display itself is through conquest. So it's not just an internal. There may be an internal revolt, But it may be that the society, the energies, the society is so torn that it creates an opportunity for any geopolitical enemy of it. And that's certainly, the West is experiencing both of those things. And I suspect that it's the latter that's most important here, because in the case of the West, the institutions are so, what I was saying earlier, the institutions so dominate our lives, there's no escaping them. So those people that hoped, for example, that Donald Trump would save this, or that, Brexit leaving would save this, I don't think that's right. I don't think they can be saved. I think it's too late. It's not that I don't have sympathy with that desire to see it, but I just think it's too late. And the reason I think it's too late, and the Trump presidency was fascinating. As an outsider, I don't have a vote. I wouldn't care if he was good, bad, or indifferent in one way. But what I could see is that the animosity towards him, which was unparalleled in my lifetime, I've never seen anything like it, was symptomatic of an elite that had so disassociated itself from what would normally be its base. Marriages broken up, friendships broken up, people mocked, the deplorables, that formulation. Everything about that was symptomatic of a society in total disarray. But you cannot get rid of the institutions. Now, one of the big institutions is the media in the modern world, because our society, as I said, it's one people talk about ideas all the time.
You should do a separate one on the media.
Yeah, I will do a separate one, but I'll just say this is, so even when they escape to another platform, the big tech companies turn against that same group. And what you could see was very much an alignment of interests of an elite and another group fleeing. And there's only one, and what I can see is the only beneficiaries of that will be the geopolitical enemies. So that was, again, if you think about the Russian Revolution, that was interesting, because that occurred when the enemies of Russia had so weakened the ruling power. That gave an opportunity for this other group to come in, who had already been weakening the Tsar. But that, on top of it, gave them an opportunity and gave the Soviet Union it made the Soviet Union. Or in France, all the revolutionary wars that were involved. So you can see the geopolitical and the domestic, they're really intertwined. But in the case of what's happening in Western Europe and North America, and as Australia is a kind of vassal state, I think it's hopeless, just hopeless. That whole world is gone. And the elite are not going to get what they want. They think they got what they want. They got rid of Donald Trump. They think they've got what they want. They haven't got what they want. Transgender in the military. Well, you think that's going to last? You think the military are strong enough? They've just lost, the debacle in Afghanistan, and what's happening there. No. Who's going to be a geopolitical ally of the United States anymore? Who will care? You can't trust it. It's just incompetent. And anyway, that's okay. So getting back, the broader thing about the elite is, and even I detest the elite that we've now got, because of their arrogance and ignorance. And in a way, I think they did less, because the other elites, as I said, they had to, way back when they proved themselves on the battlefield. Now, I shouldn't be, I should put aside my own distaste. of my own class, which it is. I am part of this class. I've been a member of that elite, very minor thing, and it's a funny kind of elite. The modern elite is one in which it goes from zillionaires to a school teacher. That's a weird kind of elite, but it's basically you've got one in group, and then you've got the out group, and everyone's kind of scrambled on board that in group.
They're an elite, though, in the sense that they're the educators, so they're at the forefront of the narrative as far as
yes, they direct the narrative, they instruct in the narrative.
So that's what they are as an elite. But like I guess the point you're making is that, as in no other time in history, the elite now doesn't have a right necessarily to think that they are the elite based on the actions of their forefathers or the development of a
no, in fact, everything about this elite, this is really interesting, is if you think about it, first of all, they deny they're an elite. So they get leverage by purporting not to be an elite, by being oppressed. So the only way, Michelle Obama, she writes a thesis, was it a PhD? But anyway, about, the way in which, even in Princeton, people are discriminated against, this kind of thing. And then she goes and works as a diversity officer. This kind of, you keep playing a victim card. We all know this, everyone. No one believes it anymore, except the people who speak it. They believe it vociferously, and their audience of 17, 18, 19-year-old kids believe it, and maybe up until 22 or 23. But anyone with eyes to see can just see it's just total nonsense. If you've got affirmative action programs, if they're working at all, then you're advantaged by being disadvantaged. That's the whole point of it. So if you keep saying you're still disadvantaged, even though you've got that, Michelle Obama was still disadvantaged. Well, this is just crazy. But people, But so you've got an elite that is kind of masking itself. Part of me thinks this goes right back to the overthrow of the old elite. That is the so-called bourgeois, of which Marx is one in my terms. Bourgeois just meant a city dweller back at the time of the French Revolution. He uses it to mean not only an owner of private property, but the owner of private investment property, basically, capital. But really, it is, the class that had the most the profession that had the most representatives in the political bodies operating at the time of the French Revolution, or thanks to the French Revolution, the National Assembly and such like. They were the lawyers. Marx's student was a law student. Time and time again, what we see is, that's the training. Why law? Well, it's words. Words also get holding of legislation, then you can decide who gets what, how, and where the lines of legality and illegality are. So that's what our elite really comes out of. That's the great big. It's the movement from people that laid down their lives originally way back to people who speak. That's not going to be that satisfactory. It is true that we live in a very different kind of world. That kind of, part of me says that part of me wants to speak as if we're beyond the need for valour and the military and all that, but we're not really beyond it, are we? Because our geopolitical problems aren't solved. And, China is a geo-military. Well, if they're not, I tell you what, the Pan-Islamists are. They're definitely a military threat. And no doubt about it. And again, Afghanistan, those characters, they would love to take over the world. They would love to see the world that is the society you've got is exactly the patterns of behaviours that are engaged in by everyone within that society. That includes, as a necessary element of it, its economic production. just as if you're talking about someone today living in the 21st century and you say, oh yeah, what's it like? Well, you know, I get up in the morning, I drive my car, I watch Netflix in the evening, we do this and we eat this, and you'll see everything involved in that requires someone somewhere to do something to make that happen. That's the division of labour. And this is the point that I've been getting at. That division of labour, that process of activity, you try and change one of those things, or you try and think it doesn't matter. What is going to be very interesting is to see the reaction to that. The reaction to you cut down a certain industry, or you cut out a certain industry. Now you can do that, but the consequences of that, you would really have had to think through the entirety of the division of labour to have a really good idea of the kind of society that you were making, because you don't know what other needs would be spawned by doing this or that. Let me give you a more concrete example to make that clear. The communists. The communists wanted to ensure that no one could employ someone to do something. Great. So what was never in the theory, what was never in Marx's theory, was the black market. Because people wanted access to all sorts of products that were considered just luxury products, that were considered to be bourgeois, that were considered to have a bad influence upon people. Or let's even not talk about, let's just think of how pornography, the way in which is now mainstream, of course, but pornography was not always tolerated in Western, democracies. It was seen as something very bad, but there was a demand for it, a market for it. So that comes into the society in spite of the attempt to suppress it. So if we're talking about, and this is really where I'm getting at, if we're talking about how to create a society on the basis of the principles that we have, which is precisely, I think, the wrong way to talk about society, but it is the most common way to talk about society. It's the way to talk about society that comes from these cultural leaders, that is coming out of the universities. What you're doing is you're not thinking realistically. You're not thinking about the material components of the society and the way in which human needs, let's not even call them needs, human desires operate within this large scale of human exchange called the economy. Now you can prohibit things. You can prohibit marijuana, you can prohibit all sorts of drugs, you can prohibit alcohol. Now does anyone seriously think that when the wowsers were prohibiting alcohol, that they were actually creating a whole gangster class, that was going to affect the police force, and that was going to... Of course they didn't think that, because they couldn't think 2 steps ahead. So if you want to think 2 steps ahead, you have to think about the division of labour and the social formation, and you have to think about classes. This is where Marx was on a good thing, but as I said, he didn't go far enough with it, because he wanted to nip the problem in the bud, because he correctly saw that classes always exist in tension. That's not his formulation. He focused upon one great tensionality, the tensionality between the owners of capital and between the industrial working class of proletariat. How all of that played itself out was, I don't think, had much at all. Marx was trying to play catch up with that. But what we could see is that tension was not what he thought it was, something that meant complete catastrophe for that class. In fact, tension can be quite productive. But there is always going to be a certain competitiveness between classes. Again, maybe the most common, and if I think of, or if you think of, the kind of political divisions that exist today, it's very clear that it's regional versus urban. And that's one of the that's one of the oldest sources of contestation, is between the rural and the urban. Because people, and let's put it this way, yes, look, the rural classes certainly depend upon the manufacturing that the urban class can deliver. That's true. But that facilitates a better life for the rural classes. But urban classes cannot live without food. So in a sense, it's what's happening in the rural areas that is the most important thing that happens, because without food you can't do anything. And this tends to be forgotten. And it's a healthy society is one in which there's an appreciation of the different interests, even though they're not necessarily common in all respects, but overall there may be a certain commonality of interests. But in order to appreciate that, then the one thing you can't do is simply come up with some ideational principle which you then want to corral the entirety of reality into accepting. Rather, what you would need to do is have a really protracted look at, a prolonged look at the division of labour, the kind of things that people are doing. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff that is in our society that's complete crap and useless. We all know it. Unfortunately, though, it exists because there are people willing to come up with a cent or a penny or a dollar or for that activity to take place. And because of that, the economics of it is a reality generating mechanism. It is a mechanism, and in the next talk will be about equality, but it is a mechanism which necessarily generates inequality. It cannot generate equality. It's not what it's there for. And people then who want to bring equality into things have to deal with the fact that they are wanting to introduce a principle, a moral norm, if you like, into a set of practices, and then all you can look at is what are the consequences of doing that. And they may have nothing to do with the outcome that you would wish to have. Now, I realise I've been roaming far and wide, so let me just sum up this. When we speak of ideas, especially in terms of social ideas about how we want to fix up the world, it is very easy to forget that we are not talking simply about, that our idea creates a homogenized world. It flattens everything out. But our practices are one in which different social formations over time have evolved out of different divisions and alongside with different divisions of labour. They are, if you like, different political economies. Those different political economies provide us with the material basis for our own social existence. They are intrinsic to what we are. And Marx was sort of onto something when they do play a role in the kind of things we think. I don't like his talk about it. It determines and all that. It's too push and pull mechanistic. But it does have an impact. It does influence things. But nevertheless, the fact that we're symbolically generating creatures also means we're capable of all sorts of symbolic messes, symbolic contradictions, dead ends, imaginative quandaries, imaginative disasters that may or may not have anything to do with the underlying social, economic socioeconomic conditions. They're not necessarily a match-up. But nothing that we can dream up here is of any consequence, of any good consequence, unless it really appreciates the texture and the complexity and the tensionality and the conundrums and paradoxes that play themselves out in that economic, productive world. So the division of labour is intrinsic to... I'll put it this way. I don't think there's ever been a time in history where more people thought that they could fix up the world than now. From 15, 16-year-old kids going to fix this up and that. That we have an entire industry, and now education is now often called an industry, of people who think it's their task to fix up the world. Well, and I would also say I find it paradoxical, indeed deeply ironic, that it is also occurring at a time when the world is more complex than it's ever been. And the only way that this mismatch between the ambition of those with principles to fix things, the complex conundrums and messes of our daily life can match, is to completely oversimplify our understanding of the problems, which is no solution. And that's the sad, indeed dire position that we are in, and that's behind this lecture and this series of lectures. Thank you.